Good evening. My name is Alan Smason, and welcome to NOLA Theater Folk. This is the NOLA Theater Talk Show, which is part of NOLA Theater Folk Facebook group, and also the theatercriticism.com Facebook page, which is in support of the theatercriticism.com Facebook website, which that is Facebook, notwithstanding the support page, but the theatercriticism.com website is what I meant to say. The reason why we have the Facebook page is essentially to help with social media to support articles, reviews when they're released. And we use that in these days of quarantining and staying at home, sheltering in place, as it were, to essentially use that for people who don't want to necessarily become members of the NOLA Theater Folk Facebook group, which is really more or less a New Orleans-centric kind of group. But we are dealing with more issues than just New Orleans. We're dealing with a lot of things that we face in the theater industry that have to do with all kinds of outside factors. One of the things that has gone on in the last several weeks, of course, obviously, is as everybody has stayed at home and theaters have been shuttered, is that theater critics have had to become very creative in how they cover theater and what they do. And of course, not having theater performances to review puts us into a rare space. How do we maintain our connection to the community? How do we also make sure that we as critics are being responsive to what our community needs and wants? There are a lot of questions that come up, especially during the times that we've witnessed in the last several weeks following several deaths in the African-American community. Again, the Black Lives Matter protests that have resounded across the United States and been felt pretty much to the heartstrings of many Americans. Many people who are not necessarily going out in the streets because of the pandemic going on, have found a lot of what is being said in the movements as something that they have found some passion for as well, and are actively engaging in social media, actively becoming part of what hopefully is the answer to the problem, hopefully the solution, rather than contributing to the perpetuation of it. So in line with that, and just to sort of get an idea, feel for what theater critics are doing, and what we as critics are doing to be responsive to the needs of the theater community at large, as well as our own communities where we live, I've invited three important members of the American Theater Critics Association. And I'm going to put our brand up there, ATCA as it is. So when we talk tonight about ATCA, you'll know what it is, American Theater Critics Association. It is the largest professional theater critics organization in the United States, and is responsible for, I won't say naming, but let's say coming up with suggestions for the regional Tony Awards, as well as providing some of the voting that goes on for the Theater Hall of Fame. So we're a very time-honored institution. We have a number of people who represent some of the very best among our craft. And again, we want to tell everybody that tonight we're going to be dealing with a lot of questions about diversity and inclusion. I'm going to first bring in Kalindra Smith, but want to tell you a little bit about Kalindra first. Kalindra is a theater critic. She hails from Atlanta. She's an arts journalist. She's been reviewing theater for a number of years, and she does that for Arts Atlanta, or Arts ATL. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Atlanta Magazine, and of course, American Theater Magazine, and TDF Stages. She's the co-chair of the American Theater Critics Association's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. The other chair is not with us tonight, but we know that Kalindra will do a good job in filling in everybody as to what her committee does. She is also a member of the ATCA Executive Committee, also known affectionately as the XCOM. She also facilitates theater criticism workshops for students across the country. She's an alumna of the Gold Ring Arts Journalism Program in the Newhouse School, at Syracuse University and a past National Critics Institute fellow at the O'Neill Theater Center. And without any further ado, let me please welcome Kalundra Smith. And Kalundra, I want to thank you for being here tonight. Kalundra, this is, again, NOLA Theater Talk. What we're going to talk about tonight is not necessarily going to be just about New Orleans. And I will tell you, as I mentioned to you, we had a wonderful discussion a little over a month ago. We had all of the major theater critics who came to New Orleans, either had retired here, such as Bruce Burgun and Jim O'Quinn, but we also had Ted Main and Brad Rhines and myself, and we were joined by Chris Rawson. Now, what's wrong with that picture? All men and all white men. And, again, it is not necessarily, the case that everybody in the American Theater Critics Association, represent, those particular groups. But it just so happens that here in New Orleans, we don't have any women. We don't have any women of color who are really involved in doing theater criticism. We have a lot of people involved in the arts, a lot of people who are involved as actors, as directors. We just don't have theater critics, who are doing that. And again, that's one of the things I think that you're dealing with, right?
Yes. So one of the reasons that the Diversity and Inclusion Committee formed a couple of years ago was to help to expand the opportunities for diverse theater critics across the country. We have been working vigilantly and very closely with the membership committee to try to engage journalists of color, to get them into the organization, as well as to provide opportunities for people to be published. Because what we have found is that it's not a lack of interest that has kept critics of color out of the field. It is lack of opportunity, because so often we judge people, based on what they've done before. And if you are unable to get the opportunities at the newspapers and the magazines because you don't necessarily have that built-in network of connections, because we all know it's all about who you know, then how do you get the experience? So we have been working to do that, as well as provide diversity and inclusion training at each and every ACCA event for our existing membership, so that when folks are encountering work that comes from a culture that they're unfamiliar with, they're able to review it with a level of expertise and cultural understanding, so that they don't have flubs in their reviews. One of the things that our committee often says is assume cultural difference before you assume artistic deficiency. So we are always working on making sure that we're not only educating critics who are coming in, but educating the critics we already have and providing resources.
And I think one of the problems in journalism, they talk about, you can't get a job unless you've already had a job. And I think that's the biggest problem when people first get out of college. What do? They want to get a job. They go to any kind of magazine or newspaper or even radio or TV, and they say, what's the first thing? Well, what have you done? Well, they say, well, I haven't done anything yet, but I can. I'm quite talented. Just give me a chance. And they said, we're not going to give you a chance until you've actually proven yourself and done something. So it's a circle that's got to be defeated somehow or other. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems we have with getting more diverse critics into the field, don't you think?
That's one of the issues. Another issue, of course, is that folks tend to hire who they know. And sometimes they hire from their alumni networks. And so if you didn't go to one of the colleges that, that publication tends to recruit from, or if your, father and the publisher of that company didn't play golf together on Saturdays, it's all about who you know in any field, but in journalism in particular is deep.
And again, all we can do is, make the opportunities available. I'd like to bring on another member of your team, as it were, another member of your committee, and that's Amanda Finn. Before I bring Amanda in, I want to introduce her. She's from Chicago, right? Basically, she's been a travel journalist. She's also done lifestyle work, and as well as, being a theater critic. Some of her features have been featured in Huffington Post. She's been in Ms. Magazine, American Theater Magazine, as have you. And many of her pieces she's had have actually won some awards. She's a member of ATCA since 2015. She's been involved with the Wisconsin State Journal, New City Stage, and many, many others. She's currently serving as the secretary of the Steinberg New Play Award, which is actually the Harold and Mimi Steinberg New Play Award, which actually gives $25,000 in first prize money to the person, the playwright, selected for the best new play of the year. And I believe it's the best new play of the year outside of New York. Although, I think sometimes, people want to know why they're not including New York, because we have Tony Awards, we have Outer Circles, we've got Drama Desk. Lots of people in New York get awards already. So these are really intended for people, new plays, who are not already established in New York. And she is also a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So let me bring in Amanda and Amanda Finn. Thank you very much for joining us. And again, Amanda, you are on, as is Kalindra, the chair, but you are on the American Association's, the Theater Critics Association Diversity and Inclusion Committee as well, right?
I am, yep. And I'm the secretary of the XCOM. Okay,
so how long have you been involved with this particular committee that we're talking about, diversity and inclusion?
Basically since its inception. Mm-hmm. When we gathered together at the Milwaukee, oh no, I don't remember the name of it.
It was the Intersection Summit.
There we go. Mm-hmm. We had like the first official meeting of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And when I found out about it, I asked at the time Martha and Kalindra if I could join.
And again, was this something that sort of resonated with you as a critic, that you could see that this was something that you needed to work towards to more or less equalize the playing field, as it were, for critics?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I'm clearly not a woman of color, I am still a woman. And as much as we'd like to hope otherwise, women are still very much in the minority in really most media organizations, but especially in criticism. For the very few full-time positions that we have in theater criticism around the country, I think there's one female in any of those positions since Helen Shaw left.
Lily Janiak at the San Francisco Chronicle. We lost Karen D'Souza from the San Jose Mercury News late last year. So Elizabeth Vincentelli is strictly freelance. So I mean, it's dire for women.
Yeah, and I've been the only woman in plenty of spaces just as a journalist. Oftentimes, if I go to cover like a convention, for example, in the press room, I have never been. Oh, this is going to be a double negative. I have only ever been the only woman in the room.
Wow.
Except for maybe the artist we're talking to. So I feel very much that diversity and inclusion in every capacity is extremely important, not just for journalism, but for basically any field in this country.
Yeah, well, I am the only woman reviewing theater in Atlanta. And I occasionally used to review for the daily newspaper in Atlanta, the AJC, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And at that time, I was the first African-American woman to have a regular kind of reviewing freelance gig with the AJC. And that was like 3 years ago. So it's crazy.
Yeah.
So as I said, we had 5 men on the last Theater Critics panel discussion that we had. Tonight we're going to have 3 women, and of course I'm the host, so I don't get to rotate too much. But I want to bring in our third guest for tonight, and that's going to be Sherry Flanders. Sherry is an actor, comedian, public speaker. She also hails from Chicago. She's been a teacher at Second City Theater. She's been a member of the American Theater Critics Association for some time, with her writing featured in McSweeney's and the Chicago Defender. She's a freelance critic for the Sun-Times, the Chicago Reader, Rescripted, Perform Inc., New City, Chicagoland Musicland Theater, and the Windy City Times. Her work as a critic led her to be invited to cover the Sundance Film Festival as part of her press inclusion initiative. Now, she's also performed at the Engaging Women Conference, been a guest on Vocalo Radio. I'm not quite sure what that is. Their morning show, I guess, AMP Council of Feminist Thought Show, and was a panelist for the Inside Jokes Comedy Conference hosted by Women in Comedy, and she's represented by NV Talent. So we're going to stick around, and Sherry's going to throw us a couple of jokes a little bit later on, but let's see if we can bring her in as well. Sherry Flanders,
Hello.
welcome to NOLA Theater Talk, and again, we want to thank you for being here. Sherry, you heard in the background what both Amanda and Kalendra had to say. What, first off, brought you to the American Theater Critics Association? First off,
Actually, it was Amanda.
Okay.
Who taught me about that. I came to criticism actually kind of accidentally. There was the national story about Hetty Weiss in the New York Times, in all of the newspapers. That was a local Chicago story. So because of that, there was then a open call through CHITAC, the Chicago Accountability Coalition, to call for new writers. I am a writer, but I had never done theater criticism specifically, and I primarily perform in comedy and not on the traditional theater side of things, so that left me open to review theater, not as a conflict of interest. So that was how I entered the industry.
And I have to say, there are a lot of people who probably do not know the story that you're referring to, but I will tell you that at that conference here in New Orleans in 2015, when that story broke, I was the conference chair, and I was bringing about 80 plus American Theater Critics Association members and their spouses and dependents, in some cases, down to New Orleans to come witness the city. You know, we had some wonderful events, etc. And the long and the short of it is this story broke, and Hetty Weiss, just so I think we should set the table is to let people know what she was one of the major Chicago area theater critics, and she was taken to task, as it were, by a number of people who thought that she was either insensitive or just not really getting it, if that's the best way to say that she had spoken specifically about some graffiti, I think, and she didn't quite understand that the graffiti wasn't what she was basically arguing about. It's sort of like what people were talking about, with people who just haven't been informed. And I think it came from a background of she was being critical of certain things that she didn't really need to be critical of. And I'm not probably explaining it very well. Kalendra, you might want to pick it up and explain a little bit better.
Sure. So what happened in short in Chicago is that Steppenwolf Theater, which is a world-renowned theater, produced a show called Passover. It was a world premiere by a woman named Antoinette Nwandu. And it took a classic play, which some people may be familiar with, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot.
Sure.
And modernized it and set it in the south side of Chicago, and essentially positioned it with two young Black men kind of pondering their existential existence and whether they would be able to pull themselves up out of poverty while also contending with police violence and other things happening in their neighborhood. And so in the review, Hetty Weiss made some assertions about the community and the playwright's intentions that did not ring true to the leadership at Steppenwolf or the theater or the community that she mentioned. And so, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in a number of instances that the Chicago theater community had of being dissatisfied with her cultural competence in her reviews. And so that led to her resignation from the Chicago Sun-Times. And I'll also note that Hetty Weiss also was a dance critic. Okay.
But again, I don't remember the everything that was done, but it was at the time shocking. But as you pointed out, this was not the only incident in which she was accused of not being sensitive and not being responsive. That this was the veritable straw that broke the camel's back. That, you know, that's it. That's the final, you know, piece. And in many ways, we've sort of seen that same response, not necessarily related to you know, to theater criticism, but, you know, the George Floyd killing, as it were, you know, unleashed that straw that broke the camel's back. That so many people had pent up after so many killings, et cetera, that it just unleashed itself. I would say that you know, very much people just felt like that was it too, and they weren't going to take it anymore. Again, Hetty's gone. Have things improved in Chicago? I'm going to ask because there's two people there from Chicago. Have we gotten new critics who are a little bit more responsive now, or what?
You're looking at two of them.
Yes. There are many new critics. There are, like myself and Amanda, and there are many, many others. As I believe both Kalendra and Amanda talked about before, there are not very many paid jobs, so most of us are freelance. This is not what we do full time. So there is only one full-time critic here in Chicago. So the ability to cover everything that would like to be covered by these new critics is just not there. So we're here, but we're not necessarily represented in the same way.
Well, again, you've got one more critic full-time in Chicago, which is what, the second biggest city in the United States. I don't know if LA has taken them over yet, but you know, you've got one more critic than we have in New Orleans, which is zero. We have no full-time critics here. Everybody is sort of paid to be a freelancer, and we used to have beautiful representation. Richard Dodds was a critic here full-time. At one point, David Cuthbert, of course, and we had many other people. Those are names that don't probably resonate with you because David hasn't been full-time with the paper now in probably maybe 11 years. So, you know, when they started to have the cutbacks in the newspapers, that was sort of one of the fallouts, was that they weren't going to have arts reporters or arts critics to do a beat anymore. And they consolidated a lot of people. So, and I know that you all are experiencing in Chicago the same as you probably are in Atlanta, Kalendra, right?
Yes. So we don't have any full-time theater critics in Atlanta either. The Daily Paper laid off all of their critics during the recession in 2008. So everybody, and that's actually how Arts ATL was born, is that the critics from the Daily Paper formed their own outlet to continue the work. Literally within 30 days after being laid off. And the site persists. But I also want to say that I think that as much as we want to have the opportunity to have the full-time, full benefits eligible, pension in retirement life of a newspaper or magazine journalist of old, I think that with those layoffs came opportunities for entrepreneurship and for diversifying voices that didn't exist before. I don't think the three of us would be sitting here with you today if the reign of the Daily Paper critic had not been cracked by the crushing of the economy and the evolution of what news media has become, because I think that there's a democratization of voices and a demand for diversity and representation that was very easy to ignore when a corporation was able to kind of decide what the voice of a city was, as opposed to allowing the people to choose who they feel speaks best for them.
I got you. Well, let's take a little quick break. As we know, in tradition in our NOLA Theater Talk, we usually ask people what they're having to drink. And in Amanda's honor, I have a Sazerac. This is the first time I've repeated a drink, but Amanda had her very first Sazerac in Spring Green, and that was because there was a fellow from New Orleans who brought all the makings for Sazerac up there and made her one, right?
Who was that, Alan? I don't remember.
Yes. So what are you drinking tonight, Amanda?
Oh, I have a whiskey sour.
All right. Very nice. Do you any particular whiskey you're dealing with?
Some kind of generic whiskey.
Okay. All right. You prefer bourbon? or like
Honestly, I will drink any hard liquor.
any hard liquor.
I don't
All right.
drink beer. I'm very picky about wine. So
Okay.
I will. The only reason I even mixed it is because I got a shipment of mixers for a piece I'm working on. I expected a tiny bottle. They sent me 60 pounds of them.
Oh, fantastic. Sherry, what you got tonight?
Oh, who, me? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm not a huge drinker,
Ooh.
but I am a runner. Years ago, I ran 2 marathons, and so what it stuck with me is that I really love Gatorade.
Oh, okay.
So not a product endorsement, but I drink it a lot.
It is a drink, and I believe it was called Gatorade, if I'm not mistaken, that it was developed at the University of Florida, right, where they have
Correct.
the Gators. You know, so
Yep.
so that was where it came. I remember being at summer camp back in like 1966, 67, or something like that, and one of the guys was from the Tallahassee area, and he told me about Gatorade, and you got to drink the Gatorade.
Yep.
And I didn't even know what he was talking about at that point. And you know who was on my camera, who was in my cabin at that time, was a fellow who went on to do a lot of stuff in sports. So we talk about Gatorade with sports, and that was Roy Firestone. You remember?
Oh, wow.
Remember the sports guys? He was my cabin mate at one point. Kalundra, what are you drinking?
Oh, I am normally a lover of cocktails, wine, and everything else, but I am so boring. This is good old-fashioned H2O.
I'm not alone.
You want to know why New Orleans Saints people make fun of the Atlanta Falcons people, right? They always do that.
Oh, we're not doing the Saints-Falcons debate this evening.
Well, I don't want to stir that up because we don't even know whether or not we're going to have a season at this point in time. So I don't want
In
to.
Atlanta, we say the Aints.
All right. Wait a minute. Is it 28-3 right now? I'm trying to see what time it is. Oh, okay. All right. So let's move on. Again, one of the reasons I asked you all in tonight was to talk a little bit about where we are. I'd like to get an idea, where you find problems with your own communities, and I guess being the fact that we are in a national association where you've heard from other people where things are deficient. We've experienced some really emotional protesting over the course of the last several weeks. It's not going to end. And one of the reasons I wanted to have this talk tonight rather than do it a week from tonight is because a week from tonight is Juneteenth. And I will bet you that there's going to be a lot of people involved in more protesting and a lot of things about that because of the symbolic, fact of that date and what it means to people. So what I really wanted to try to get an idea about is if we can talk about what you think we need to do as critics to perhaps make things better, and what other people who are involved in theater can do to get more women, to get more people of color, to make theater criticism and perhaps involvement of people in actual shows have more of an impact and become more a part of the everyday scene that we just don't see now. So who wants to take that first? Kalundra?
That's a big one.
You're the chair, or the co-chair. So let me let you speak to that. And again, I know the others will chirp in right after.
Sure. So I think when it comes to our theater scenes across the country, the audience needs to know how much power they have. If you are a single ticket buyer or a subscriber to a theater, the theater's programming rests in you. And I think audiences need to know that if you are someone who loves live performance, loves theater, there's such an array of stories out there. There's so many cool, unique, innovative, funky, different, awesome things that are happening in the theater scene, and artists are always innovating. I mean, I think that the current social distancing and quarantine has shown us that we immediately turn to artists in times of crisis to help us to sort out what's happening in our world. And so I think that the audience should know that you have so much say by writing a letter to a theater's artistic director, managing director, president of the board to say, hey, I heard about this play in another city and can we bring it here? Or, hey, is there any way that we can tell more stories about this? So I want to make sure that I emphasize that the audience should feel empowered, that if there are certain topics that you want to see covered, if there are certain historical figures that you want to see shows about, if there are certain issues that you'd be interested in seeing a play about, or if there's something that's just beauty or entertainment for beauty and entertainment's sake that you want to see, you as the audience member have a whole lot of sway in what theaters will produce. As far as the field of theater criticism and journalism at large, I think that what we are looking at in the field of criticism in particular is that sometimes we have to rethink who we see as an expert on a thing. I think for so long, people have been trained to see, the group of 5 guys that you had as the only people who can be experts on an art form. And I think that folks should be willing to broaden their perspectives and see that criticism can be a conversation. It's not necessarily an open and shut door, and that the conversation is richer and more interesting when you have a variety of voices from people who come from different walks of life.
Okay. Anything you want to add to that, Sherry?
Yeah, I do want to piggyback off of that. In addition to what Kalendra said, and I definitely agree with all of that, I think as a critic, I think we need to reinvent the idea of critics as being part of the community as opposed to being separate from the community. I do think that there is a perception of a critic as being kind of in an ivory tower looking down at the community with a little bit of judgment, but separate from it. And I think one of the things that I've kind of accidentally found out as someone who is also an actor and performer is that I have the ability to kind of move within the community in a way that I couldn't if I was completely separate from it. I think recently, Regina Victor from Rescripted, they did a great piece on some of the things that were going on with Victory Gardens. And because they have such a great relationship with the community, also being someone who is a producer of theater, there is a trust level in having the ability to access certain people and get a deeper story that I don't think some of the other critics who are a little bit further removed from the community can get. So speaking to what Kalendra said about seeing the community just from different eyes and who is an expert, I think relying on people within our community to do the reporting, I think that really makes a difference.
And I don't want to leave you out, Amanda. So
I'm just here as an ally, man. I'm not going to step on Kalendra and Sherry.
One of the things that I have talked about. I come from a situation where I'm perceived as coming from a position of privilege, and I indeed do come from a position of privilege. But a lot of people don't understand how tough it has been for people who were Jewish years ago. They experienced quite a bit of prejudice, and I mean, I can go back and name the movie, for instance, Gentleman's Agreement, where Gregory Peck is suspected of being Jewish, and how the perception, how the people turn on him, even his fiance, etc. When she believes that he might be, and again, I'm proud, just as everybody is, of their heritage, etc. But it was hard for me to understand the kinds of prejudice that I would have experienced were I to have grown up in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and that there were indeed quotas for people who were doctors and attorneys and things of that sort. That this all opened up really in the 60s, around the same time as opportunities for African Americans, blacks in America, were able to achieve some standing, in many cases for the first time. So I have to tell you that there is a lot of resonance for me. But again, I cannot deny the fact that I am perceived by people as coming from a position of privilege. And it is something that I I can't do anything about. You know, it is one of those things. But I do understand, and you know, perhaps having you know, been raised in New Orleans and seen the different things that I did as a kid, and I do remember having the little card on the streetcar that you had to move further back depending on how many people of color were on the back of the streetcar. That if you needed to accommodate them, you had to move forward, move that card, and you know, when you're being sort of put in a position where, why do we have to move that card, and why do we have 4, not 2, but 4 different bathrooms? You know, I mean, who came up with that except maybe a plumber? You know, you can't understand why you would have to have that kind of thing. And of course, I never remember so much the water fountains that were differentiated between white and colored, but I definitely remember at public restrooms, etc., for 4 of them. And you know, why they would do that, you just never did make much sense to me. Again, we've come a long way. I know that we have a long way to go, and I understand that one of the things that I think the Black Lives Matter movement is insisting upon is that people should start listening more and paying attention than we have ever done before. And hopefully people who do come from a position of privilege will maybe understand a little bit more and perhaps be able to appreciate what their brethren and sisters have gone through. So anybody want to come? Yeah, I don't want to get too heavy. You know, we're talking about theater criticism, but it is you know, right now we're in a very interesting time, and it is a time where a lot of people's feelings are raw, and you know, I think it's going to take us a while to get back to where we can get work done and really concentrate. And it's not helped by the fact that we're also having to shelter in place. Do you think? Kalinda, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that in some ways we have overcomplicated this, and in some ways we've oversimplified it. I think that what it boils down to is fear versus love. You know what I mean? I think that's what it's really about. I think that what the Black Lives Matter movement and other human rights movements are all calling for is for love. You know, if we all in our everyday lives just embraced, respected, and were kind to everyone we encountered, whether they dressed the way we thought they should, wore their hair the way we thought they should, if they spoke in a way that we didn't think they should. I mean, there's so many things we use to justify being unkind. We hear somebody speak with an accent that's unfamiliar to us, and we automatically say, oh, that person's not deserving of my kindness, right? Or we see someone who is dressed in a way that we don't agree with because they wear a hijab, right? Or a burqa, and we decide, oh, that person is different from me, that's unfamiliar to me, they're not worthy of my kindness, my love. And if we could just strip those things away, the fear that comes up when we face something that is unfamiliar to us, and if we embrace it with love and a genuine wanting to learn, and a genuine curiosity as opposed to skepticism and fear, you know, we would all be so much better off. And what happened, I think, when you talked about George Floyd in Minneapolis, is that somebody saw him and decided that he was not worthy of love. He was not worthy of the benefit of a doubt. You know, it has been already, they've already found that the crime he was allegedly accused of with the counterfeit money, it wasn't him. You know, they looked back at the security video and they found that that was not him. It was somebody else who actually doesn't look like him at all. And so I think that, you know, if the owner of that convenience store had not looked at him and decided he was unworthy of love, that man would still be alive and with his children. So I think it just boils down to that. You know, we want to put so much, we want to put so many, as my mom would say, my mom's a college professor, she would say $10 words. We want to put so many $10 words on things, but really we only need one 4-letter word, and
right.
It's love.
And Lin-Manuel Miranda probably said it best after the Pulse nightclub shooting, you know, love is 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 love. I mean, you can't deny the fact that if people keep an open mind, what's going to go on, that we can get together and we can get along. And Rodney King was the one who said, "Can't we all get along?" You know, that was in a nutshell back in '92 what we should have actually had a national conversation with. And you know, it seems odd that we're still sort of rehashing the same stuff. Now, maybe we've got friction on this one now. Maybe it's going to take. But, you know, in all the times that we had all the marches going on and all the protesting going on in St. Louis and going on prior to that in other cities, you would wonder why, you know, it didn't take and why we had to wait till 2020 to begin to start to make some movement in it.
I'd like to speak to that, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
I think everything that Clenger said, I agree with. In addition, the idea of keeping an open mind is a passive statement. We have to push to have an open mind. It's not something that we can just kind of kick back and do. We have to work hard to find that understanding, to listen to others, to reach out, to have those hard conversations. And to your point of being a Jewish man grappling with his privilege, you should actually have my husband on because he's actually a critic and also a Jewish man. And I know that there have been a lot of conversations in the community about that intersection of being a victim of discrimination, but then also potentially having that privilege and being white appearing for some Jewish people, not everyone. So you should have him on to talk about that. That's not my lane.
Yeah, I understand.
But I think it is about urgency. It's not something that we can just kick back and say, hey, love you. That love has to be active. I always say about love that love is like bread and it has to be baked fresh every day. You know, otherwise it gets stale. You have to work on it. It's a daily action. It's a daily choice to make. It's a daily choice to reach out, to understand, to push, to sit in discomfort, to have those conversations, to forgive, to try and understand something that we don't get, to not get caught up in our feelings. Love is a verb.
And you know, perhaps we could take a lesson from Oscar Hammerstein II, you know, who advocated for the opposite in a sense, but was actually advocating for what you're talking about by saying you have to be carefully taught, and that if you're going to engage in hating people, it's got to start at an early age, because this is not something that is natural for people to hate one another. And that you can look in any classroom where all the little kids in first grade and second grade, et cetera, are assembled, you know, they get along splendidly. It's only when later on stereotypes are reinforced, et cetera, in their minds, and that they begin to take on those perceptions that maybe they shouldn't extend their love, and maybe, you know, they are better, or maybe they should be better than someone else, and that's a sad situation. Amanda, you've been pretty quiet.
I've been listening.
Maybe we can turn to a little something in terms of you know, ATCA, in terms of what, you know, the whole point of having the conversation tonight was not only to talk about theater and of course the current events that are going on, but also about you know, diversity and getting more people involved. Do you think that we're doing a good job now in ATCA? I mean, or are we just really starting down the trail? In other words, where can we make changes more quickly?
So, okay, I'm ready for this one. So one of the things that we talked about at the Milwaukee conference, myself, Kalindra, and Deep Tran, is that this is a process. And becoming an anti-racist, non-white supremacist, diverse organization takes time and energy and dedication and learning. And I think that the ATCA that I joined 5 years ago is a completely different looking organization than it is right now. When our elections are over next week, we will have an extremely diverse executive committee. Whereas when I joined, I think there were 2 women and then it was just a bunch of white men. So in that regard, I think that we're making really positive and astoundingly fast changes. But when it comes to the other stuff, the gritty stuff, the deeply entrenched notions that we have about ourselves and our world and our biases, that's going to take time. And I think that our membership as a whole is taking baby steps, but those baby steps matter and should be celebrated because they're, 10 baby steps further than they were before. And that's a long way of saying it's going to take a long time, but we're working on it. Just like criticism as a career field, we're working on it. I think Chicago is a great example of where criticism could go. 5 years ago, there weren't that many women running publications or non-binary folks running publications. And now we have more critics of color. We have more publications, which is really bizarre, but amazing. And I think that that's what all of criticism could be. We could finally have an organization that looks like the audience. That's and not like all the white 70-year-old people audience, an ideal audience, which is all different faces and races. And
I'm sort of glad you brought that up because that's sort of the area I wanted to go to. One of the other areas of inclusion and diversity that people, have been concentrating on lately has been LGBTQ members of our association. Not only in terms of people who are LGBTQ on stage, getting involved in terms of in some cases, actors who are playing roles that are perhaps not intended for them on the script, but that they're playing them cross-gender as far as that goes. The whole idea of identification has become very important. And I know that a lot of people in ATCA have begun using the pronouns at the end of their names and their letterhead and things of that sort to identify that. It's been difficult for me to transition into that, but that's my own personal journey and my own personal problem as far as that goes. But I'd like to get a feel from Kalundra. You're the co-chair. Tell me a little bit about why that's so important, and perhaps do you put your pronouns, etc., at the end of your emails, etc.? Do you do that now, or have you felt the need to do that?
So I'll speak to the first question first. So on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, when we talk about diversity, we're talking specifically about people of color, women and or non-binary people. And within that, we're talking about LGBTQ plus community, 100%, because we know that there's intersectionality. We actually are about to launch a monthly newsletter. And in that newsletter, on the Meet the Committee section, everybody's pronouns will be next to their name. And that's something that we, feel very, very passionate about. We also have been in talks about launching a series of workshops for arts journalists and critics. And one of those workshops will actually be about discussing gender identity and non-binary identities in theater. I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that so many of us were taught really unhealthy things about what it means to be LGBTQIA+, right? So we have to be kind to ourselves as we're unlearning. I think what happens so often is when we're introduced to something new and unfamiliar, we start to judge ourselves in a, am I a good person, am I a bad person type of way. And so then we stop on our journey as we're making progress because we don't want to have to face that some of the things that we may have taught and some of the behaviors we may have exhibited in the past weren't helpful. It does not mean you're a bad person. It does not mean that you should be thrown away. It just means that you're learning and you have to, as Sherry said, be actively pursuing an open mind and loving, right? So I would encourage you, Alan, to continue to, put your pronouns out there, because what does it hurt, right? What does it hurt you to do it? Now, I will say for me, you've actually pointed out something to me. I have not put my pronouns on there. And I should, it had not been something I had thought about, mainly because and this is not an excuse, but mainly because like I'm in the trenches of doing this kind of work every day. And I think I've established myself as a person who people trust and who's like kind to that community and who that community feels like they can come to. And I'm an ally 100%. And so it's not something I necessarily thought to do, but as soon as we hang up this call, I will do it. You know, you have my word on that. It doesn't hurt anything to do it. And because somebody else's freedom doesn't take anything away from mine. So, you know, why not put the pronouns there and just embrace it? Let people, my rule, and Amanda knows I've said this in our meetings a million times. We identify people as they identify themselves. That's it. We don't have to talk. It's not ours to judge. And so don't judge yourself. Don't judge others, you know, just go on the journey. Just do it. Just jump in. It's like getting pushed off the edge into the lake as a kid, and then you just do this, and then soon you're going to swim.
Well, I would qualify one other thing is that I mean, for instance, I did the story that we did on transcripts that was done here not too long ago. I was one of the few people that really talked about it, was passionate about it, and got a lot of people involved. I mean, I've never had a problem in terms of covering. The thing is that the question is am I adjusting my behavior, what I do, you know, to satisfy just a small group of people out there? And that's where my problem has always been, that I feel like I can support people and I can love people without having to change my own behaviors in terms of putting, you know, something down at the end of my name. But, you know, I understand where you're coming from. It's just something for me that's always been a little, I always figure that, you know, I'm an old guy now. I'm over the hill, and it's hard to, you know, the old thing about the dog and new tricks. But, you know,
well, one thing that I would say is at the beginning of my career, one of the I would say best things that happened to me unexpectedly was that I happened to live right around the corner from Pride Arts Theater in Chicago. And so therefore it was my favorite place to be assigned a show, because it was right around the corner, and they also do really great work. And then writing reviews at that theater for the LGBTQ community actually led to Tracy Baim, the editor of the Chicago Reader, to invite me to write for the Windy City Times right before she bought out the Reader. And it was definitely a shift in my perception. First of all, being honored with that level of trust to be able to write about a community that I was not a part of. And I would say, just as a suggestion, take it or leave it. You didn't ask for this one, but I'm going to put it out there. The idea that just because a community is smaller than the community that you're a part of, that they have like less value or should get less consideration, is one that I would just sit with, because there's tons of communities that are very small compared to the identities that I have, but it's actually more important, I think, when it is a smaller community, for me to do the things that are reaching a hand out and showing that you are welcome, that I am a safe person, that I support you, because those communities are more vulnerable because they're smaller. So, you know, I just learned little things. Like, I remember one of the first things that I learned was folks with an X. And I was like, well, isn't folks with K inclusive? And it's like, well, no. When you're writing for this community specifically, you want to use folks with an X, because you are signaling that you do know, and that they're at the top of your mind, and that you do care, and that this is safe. And it also is a reminder for me as a writer to consciously not only look through my lens, and, you know, and maybe pick up the phone and call a friend and be like, is this right? Does this sound right? Am I seeing this right? Am I missing something? If I'm not 100% sure. It's a pleasure for me, and it's an opportunity for me to learn and to open and invite others in. And though it's not their responsibility, it is an education for me. And I feel like I'm learning it and growing and being active and being an ally.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say that just hit me when you said it is an honor, because it's true. I mean, even in Atlanta, we have Out Front Theater Company, we have Out on Film. And whenever I get invitations from those places, it's one of those things where you feel like you're an honored guest to be in the space, that you're trusted with that work from a community that you're not a part. I think you worded that just so well. And it does not change, it doesn't detract from you. Again, somebody else's freedom doesn't take away from your own. But sorry, Amanda, I cut you off.
Well, I was just going to say that the more people who utilize pronouns on a regular basis in their signatures, in their work, in XYZ opportunity, it normalizes it. And it might mean that one less person has to ask if they can list pronouns, or it'll save them, you know, it'll save their moment. You know, like Sherry said, we're talking about, anytime we talk about a marginalized community, we're talking about people who are more vulnerable. And we should put ourselves in front of that. You know, we should be the folks standing in front of them at the protest to protect them, because they're our allies and our companions and friends.
And I will be the first person to say and admit, I need to be schooled in a lot of this. I need to be told, what the difference is between queer and non-binary and transgender, cisgender, and all the different terms that have come up. It seems like there's a new term a week that I'm learning, and of course, what used to be LGBT now is LGBTQ, IA, etc. I mean, there's got to be a way to make those letters get shorter now. You know,
I'd say that a lot of these terms, though, are not new, and they've actually been around for a few decades. It just keeps
going bigger and bigger. I mean, it's a whale now of all kinds of letters, etc., which I understand. But, to a certain extent, it's harder to, when you can say something easy and say this community, it's now such a long list of different communities that are within the larger community that it becomes difficult to be able to try to keep them. I mean, I just think that if we could do something along those lines, it would make people embrace it a little bit better, because every time you add another letter, it becomes, well, what is this now? It's more difficult to understand and to streamline, I guess.
It's just like theater, I think. It's like, it's a joy to go into a new play and be like, oh my gosh, what is this new play? This is a subject I know nothing about, like, especially when I go to see a play that's about like Russian history or something that I know nothing about. Right. It's a joy to step into someone else's world and to learn. And it's the same thing with terms. These terms have been around, most of them, for a very long time. It's just that they weren't in front of us because we personally don't need them necessarily, at least for ourselves, but we do need them to communicate with others. And as journalists, as critics, we absolutely need them. And we have the internet, so even if we're not like, oh, I can't remember that off the top of my head, that's there. It's just like having our style guide right there. We have resources.
I will say I've learned a lot as I've gone along. I mean, I was completely in the dark about a lot of the identification issues that there were. And I appreciate why some people use the pronouns. And as I said, it's sort of a journey. I'm on a journey right now, just like,
we're all on a journey.
Starting to keep kosher was for me a journey, and I haven't fully, employed all the kosher options for eating out, but I have it in my house. So, that's a start. That's a process. That's where I've begun. And perhaps later on, I'll not eat the shrimp sandwiches outside. It's one of those things. So let me. We're getting close to the end. Let me sort of wrap things up. If I can just ask Kalindra, what do you think is the one thing that we as theater critics can do? Just if there's one thing that we can do and keep in mind, to make things better, so that next year when we have the same talk, that we have maybe gotten a little bit closer to being more diverse and being more inclusive.
I think it goes back to what, again, I say to my committee all the time: assume cultural difference before you assume artistic deficiency. When you are encountering work from a community that is not within your culture, do your research. Read up on it, talk to people, ask questions. It doesn't take away from your authority as a critic to be curious. It actually makes people trust you more. So I would say assume that when you're in a show and you're like, ooh, something's off here, sometimes your mind can be, oh, that means that director or that actor didn't execute well. Well, is it that they didn't execute well, or is something culturally specific happening that you don't understand? And that happens in all parts of theater. If we look at a show, say like Carolina Change, right? That has a very heavy Jewish cultural themes, right? If you're somebody who's never experienced a Passover Seder, if you are unfamiliar with klezmer music, you may be completely lost at what's happening in that show. So then you need to do some educating of yourself, right, on Jewish culture and specifically Jewish African American relations in New Orleans in Lake Charles, Louisiana is actually what was set during that time period.
Right.
And that's the same thing when we talk about the Hetty Weiss example from the Chicago Sun-Times. Hetty Weiss had not done her research on the community that she was making an assertion about. And that is what lost her job. There were some things that were culturally specific that she assumed were an artistic deficiency, and she misspoke. So I think that it's just do your research.
Amanda and Sherry, anything you want to add? Because we've come to the end of the hour, and I want to sort of wrap things up. So
I would just say yes to all of that, and also that it is a conversation with our artists. It is a conversation with our audiences. It's not a one-way street. And so if I put something out there and I misspeak, I hear that and I respond to it. That doesn't necessarily mean I answer every email or every Facebook post, but it does mean that I hear it and I acknowledge it, especially if I miss something in my cultural competence. I put that in my hat and I do better going forward.
Amanda, anything?
Yeah, and to jump off of Sherry and Kalundra, I think really the big thing is just being humble. We're journalists. We write our opinions and put it in the public. We're going to put our foot in our mouths. I've done it plenty.
Same.
And it's really hard to say you're sorry and to move on, but it's also so important to be trusted by your community. And so many instances of accidental bigotry, whatever, we could move past them if we were humble enough to say, my bad, I'm sorry, I will learn and do better.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have given me, and I hope that our audience, a lot to think about tonight. This is an ongoing conversation. And again, I want to thank Kalundra Smith. I want to thank Sherry Flanders, and I want to thank Amanda Finn for being here with me tonight. Again, for those of you, this is NOLA Theater Talk, part of the NOLA Theater Facebook group that we started, the NOLA Theater Folk. And again, also we broadcast to the theatercriticism.com Facebook page. Again, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. A week from tonight, we're going to have Sean Patterson as our special guest on the, the 22nd. We have a reading of Brick by John Broder. And on the 29th, Rising Water by John Bigonnet. We hope to see you there. And for NOLA Theater Talk, this is Alan Smason wishing you all a good night, and I'll see you at the theater.